I think this is the first podcast I've done with you in 2.5 years where I'm not wearing my hostage pin.
Today is Wednesday, February 4th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Last week, the long and wrenching mission to bring home every last hostage was finally completed. After 843 days, a massive weight has been lifted from our shoulders, and many of us are now asking, is the October 7th war finally over? The answer isn't straightforward. The emotional, physical, and economic costs of this war have been staggering, and its military and political consequences are still unfolding. Thousands of Israeli troops remain in Gaza. President Trump's plan for the Strip, including a technocratic Palestinian administration, the demilitarization of Hamas, and large-scale reconstruction, have yet to make any real progress. History tells us that wars rarely end cleanly. Their conclusions are often only visible in hindsight, marked not by a single moment, but by slow, uneven shifts. To reflect on this moment, I'm joined today by our favorite historian, author, and former Israeli ambassador to the United States, the one and only Dr. Michael Oren. Let's get into it. Dr. Michael Oren, welcome back to Boundless Insights.
I am delighted to be back. Hello, Aviva.
I have a big question for you today. Is the October 7th war over?
And the answer to that is yes and no. And no. It depends on which front and under which circumstances.
Tell us.
Let's start with Lebanon, randomly. Hezbollah greatly downgraded. Does Hezbollah still have something in the order of, 50 to 100,000 rockets? It does. Will it fire them at us at a tremendous cost, knowing what it will do to them? No. So the war is over in the sense I think that Hezbollah has been effectively deterred, understands the prohibitive costs of reopening open combat with the State of Israel. So the war there is more or less ended, but Hezbollah keeps on trying to reestablish its military presence in southern Lebanon, and Israel keeps on bombing it. So the war per se has ended, but the attrition that has existed in southern Lebanon for many years is continuing. Gaza. Is the war over? Is Hamas firing 100 rockets a day at Tel Aviv? Are Hamas and PIJ squads crossing the border and massacring Israeli civilians? No. So the war, how you define war, is over. Is the conflict finished? Definitely not. And by the way, there may be a recrudescence of the conflict that could amount to war should Israel decide to move into the Hamas-controlled areas of Gaza and complete the eradication of Hamas, if that's possible. Let's go to Iran. Here we have the most anomalous situation going, Aviva, where there is a looming threat of war. And for the first time that I can remember, probably since the demonstration by Israeli reservist mothers in the lead up to the 1967 war, where Israeli mothers actually protested the fact that Israel wasn't going to war. All right, believe it or not. This is a moment where Israel is at one time kind of relief that they're not in war, but also anxious that war hasn't broken out. And what a strange combination that is.
I saw somebody post today, it's amazing how many Israelis are pissed off and impatient about missiles the size of buses not dropping on our heads.
Right. That's it. So it's on one hand, it's a bit of relief. I know from my own family, everyone's stocking up on their safe rooms and thinking about, oh my God, we have to go back into that situation where these very large missiles are going to be falling on us. On the other hand, if it doesn't happen, there's going to be widespread disappointment. So the answer to the question, is the war over or not? The answer is yes and no. It depends on which front, under how you ask the question, how you define war, and what events that will transpire in the next few days or weeks, we do not know.
It's interesting for me to hear how you describe the war, because I could have started by asking you, what are the parameters of what was the October 7th war? Certainly we know Gaza is included, but you've also included the front of Lebanon and Hezbollah, and obviously Iran, which is the backer of Hamas and Hezbollah. There's the Houthis, and they sort of went quiet, but that threat hasn't dissipated.
They'll come back if there's an attack on Iran. And I think it's also significant. I think this is the first podcast I've done with you in 2.5 years where I'm not wearing my hostage pin. So the hostages are back. Let's not forget that. So much of the war was about the hostages. That's over. Thank God. So again, it's a very complicated question, isn't it now? And there's no simple answer to it.
Let me ask you from a historian's perspective, how do wars usually end? And is there usually a definitive something that happens that makes it clear the war is over? Or can it really only be seen in hindsight?
Wars in history usually end with a bang. All right. It is the signing of the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri. It is the signing of the Confederate surrender at the Appomattox. This the British surrender at Yorktown. Very specific events where the war ends. Six-Day War ended, we know, at 6 p.m. After 6 days. And then the Yom Kippur War ended with a signing ceremony at kilometer 101. We know exactly when these war ended.
Those are all traditional wars between armies and nations.
This war may not end with a bang. It may end with a whimper. And as an historian, truly, as someone who's actually writing about a history of this war, I'm looking for where that war is going to end. Where do you actually end this book? I say to people, I'm looking for the hook to hang the ending on. And when there was wild upheaval in the Iranian streets several weeks ago, I said, oh, that would be a fitting end, the fall of the Iranian regime. That would be the end of the book. And now that's looking less and less likely. We don't know. We'd have to look back, 50 to 100 years from now and say, oh, that's when it ended.
Well, one of the things that has ended conclusively, and you said it already, was that the last hostage finally came home. Ran Gvili returned last week and was buried last week. After 843 days, there are no Israelis being held in Gaza. And actually, since 2014, there's no Israeli bodies being held in Gaza. There's a huge psychological shift that has to take place in the country. And I recall reading something that Rachel Goldberg-Polin, the mother of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin, who was taken hostage, his arm was shot off and he was ultimately killed in one of the tunnels in Gaza. His mother, Rachel, wrote that it was like being hit by a truck. And the healing can only begin when the truck moves. But the problem was, while there were still hostages in Gaza, it was like the truck was still sitting on her chest. And that feeling of not really being able to move or breathe was there. And now, at long last, the truck has begun to move.
I think the healing can't begin until we confront, in a serious way, the circumstances leading to October 7th. And I think that will remain an open sore.
And how do you mean impartial national inquiry, different from what the government is trying to do?
True, certainly. Then I propose having a state commission that doesn't necessarily involve the judiciary. I understand the government's reservation about including Supreme Court judges on that panel, because the government has been basically at war with the Supreme Court now for several years. But there are many very respective, independent voices in the state of Israel who could be part of that panel, from the right, left, religious, and secular. That is not gaining any purchase with the government. But that will remain an open sore. I don't care what political committee or commission finds. It won't be acceptable to a large segment of the Israeli population. It has to be truly independent. And then we can begin to move on. And there are other outstanding issues.
The issue of the soldiers is another huge element when we talk about this war. So 471 Israeli soldiers were killed fighting in Gaza. I don't think listeners outside of Israel can fully appreciate the reverence that Israelis have for their soldiers. Can you say a few words about the fallen and the veterans of this war?
I honestly, Aviva, I don't even know how to address this. I mean, you're talking about a phenomenon that is all-consuming for society. In the United States, less than 1% of Americans serve in the military. How many actually see active duty combat? And when was the last time American population was under, rocket and drone fire? So you can't even begin to answer that question in a way that's understandable to an American audience. I often say that our reality is not translatable, not intelligible to foreigners, and what this means. So you're dealing with upwards of 400,000 Israelis who actually served in this war, many of them in combat capacities, myself included. And for us, the war is not an abstraction. The war is very, very intense. The statistics about the number of divorces that have taken place, marriages broken up, families broken up, people suffering from severe post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've just now heard of 5,000 Israeli reservists who have lost the hearing at least 1 year. And I know of 2 of them.
Yeah, and the veterans and the sheer number of people that have war injuries, to say nothing of the stress on the families, on the parents that had the sleepless nights, the time away from their businesses and their jobs.
The bankruptcies, everything. I don't know anybody who has not been profoundly adversely affected by this war. And so it's not just the fallen, it's also the survivors. A death of a soldier, it's the death of anybody in a family is going to, shatter someone's universe. That family's never going to be the same again. We understand that, but it's not just the fallen. It's the people who are dealing with the ramifications of this war, whether they're incapacitated. I'm on the board of an extraordinary organization called Brothers for Life. And Brothers for Life is an organization that deals with soldiers who have been wounded in combat. That is, they weren't wounded in some accident in the military. They were wounded in combat. My son, who was wounded in combat, is a member of this. They have a waiting list now of 3,000 soldiers waiting just to get in.
Oh, wow.
To join the organization. We're talking about tens of thousands of soldiers who have been wounded in one way or another. And maybe wounds in this war have to be considered a different way. You know, the ground and the air of Gaza was toxic. The ground itself was saturated with untreated sewage and caused horrendous infections, including several fungi infections that killed soldiers. So cases of soldiers who were wounded, but the fungus got into the wounds and killed them. Are those battle casualties? I mean, maybe even someone who became extremely ill from being in Gaza. Is that a combat injury? So we have to start rethinking what we mean by combat injuries, too.
When we're talking about is the war over, I think these are the elements that people don't take into account. The psychological, the physical, the emotional, the economic, that could perhaps last a lifetime. So this entire generation is touched by this war.
The generations before it and the generations after it. The parents and grandparents and the children and grandchildren will be impacted by this war. I know from the trauma of my own grandkids what it was like. And every time there's a boom or every time there's a siren, how they react to it. So everybody's impacted by it. Now, you know, I've often said, I think it bears repeating, that in purely military terms, this war will be studied at West Point and Sandhurst and other military academies around the world for generations to come, because it is probably the most outstanding military victory that has been accomplished by any army certainly in modern history, perhaps in any history. And I can spend an hour and a half telling you why that the challenges that the IDF faced in Gaza alone were unmatched by the challenges faced by any other army. 500 kilometers of tunnels under reef. No one's ever remotely faced anything like that. Fighting above ground, below ground, amidst a population of 2.2 million with almost nowhere to go. Rockets falling. That's just one front. We're talking about a 7-front war. That Israel emerged the way it emerged, victorious on virtually every front. I mean, it's, you know, some of the victories are qualified. Understand that. We're living in an age where there's no what I call a Mount Suribachi moment of, you know, Marines on the hill of Iwo Jima raising a flag. We don't have necessarily moments like that. But in 21st century terms, this is an unrivaled military victory, but it comes at a cost. And you have to determine whether that victory is Pyrrhic, because it comes at a cost, as we mentioned, of blood and of treasure and of psyche and of foreign relations. All right, our foreign relations in many places are devastated. And also in terms of sovereignty. We now have foreign military forces on our soil, monitoring the IDF, limiting the IDF, very strong restraints on the Israeli military, what we can do. So that was all the cost of October 7th and this war. But there are many positive aspects to it. Never again will Israel allow terrorist organizations to build up along our borders. Never again will we allow our reserve troops to fall into desuetude, not having training, not having equipment. And most importantly, I think, is that the Haredi draft issue, which began as a left-wing issue on October 6th, 2023, is today a national issue.
And will probably animate this next election.
Sure, and the fight is being led by the religious right. So that's the transformation of this war. Okay? And by the way, it may save us, because I have long said that the Haredi issue is an existential issue for the state of Israel. And finally, people have woken up to it.
So one of the ways we can assess if the war is over, because you talked about the loss of sovereignty, is whether the families that used to live in Kibbutz Nir Oz and Nachal Oz and Be'eri are willing to bring their families back to live in those border communities alongside Gaza, whether they feel that it's safe. And that goes to the question of what's happening inside of Gaza. So the IDF is holding about half of the strip, and the other half is a big question mark about what's going to happen and who's going to govern it. President Trump has big plans that he's outlined, but it hasn't really materialized. So talk to us about your thoughts about this idea for a technocratic Palestinian administration.
Before I do, let me just tell you about another front. So, you know, I've been very close to the north and been very much involved in northern issues, bringing delegations of northerners to Washington, et cetera. I just did a trip to the north about a week and a half ago and was very dismayed. A large segment of Metula has not returned to their houses. Half of Kiryat Shmona has not returned to Kiryat Shmona. Kiryat Shmona is a ghost town. And Israel is in danger of losing the north entirely. And it's not just the fear that Hezbollah is not completely defeated. That's true in Metula, which is right along the border. But there's a sense that that the government and the state of Israel has forgotten the north.
It's not being reconstructed?
Not being reconstructed. They're not investing in new housing and new businesses and infrastructure and high tech. I came back very dismayed from this trip. That's a strategic danger to the state of Israel. And I met with so many young people who are devoted to rebuilding the north. People are building high tech pubs. People are actually building wineries and distilleries in the north. Very, very inspiring. But if there's no state behind them, it's not going to work. And we will lose the north. We will. So having defended it with blood and treasure now, and successfully in this last war, we could turn around and lose the long-term battle, which is for the defense of the north. Now, I do think that the situation in the south is somewhat better, from what I understand. There are young people who want to move back into these kibbutz, even people who hadn't lived there before, out of pure Zionism. But that's a separate question as to what's going to happen next in Gaza. You know, here, because I have an historical perspective, I look at the Trump administration policy not as the policy of any particular White House or even a Republican White House or a MAGA White House, but as an American policy. There was a statement made, about 2 weeks ago by Mr. Witkoff, where he said that Palestinians basically want what we all want. They want to have good schools for their kids. They want to have, good neighborhoods, safe neighborhoods, medical care. They want a future for their children. And I've heard this throughout the years from both administrations, and I've researched it going back to about 1776. Americans have been saying this forever, that the Middle Easterns are just basically like us. In 1872, General McClellan, the failed Union general and failed a Democratic Party candidate for the presidency, visited the Middle East, and he came back and said the one thing that I think the Americans have never listened to, which is that Middle Easterners are as alien to us as the inhabitants of Jupiter and Mars. And if we don't understand that, we'll always fail to understand them in the Middle East, to succeed in the Middle East. It's so true. And so this approach that somehow the Palestinians are just like us, and they want what we want for their kids, is going to end up failing. It's going to end up failing because if you can give them the schools and you can give them the hospitals, you give them the nice neighborhoods, but if you don't re-educate an entire society that jihad is not God's desire for the world, and that the highest sacral duty you can do is by killing a Jew, which is what generations of Palestinians have been taught to believe, and even in UNRWA schools, they're taught to believe that their highest goal is the elimination of the state of Israel and the realization of the right of return. If you don't de-radicalize that, and that does not take a year, that takes 20, 25 years, then you can build the beautiful neighborhoods, but Hamas will be in those neighborhoods in no time. And you're back to having another war. And that, I find, as a source of concern. I think it's an understatement.
Does that speak to how optimistic you are about this plan for a Palestinian administration to take over governing Gaza?
Well, who's going to protect that Palestinian administration when they start getting knocked off by Hamas?
Who's to say that Palestinian administration renounces terrorism?
Or, if it does, how long will they live? Who's going to keep them alive? Or they support terrorism. You're trying to make a model. You're trying to take a model from the United States or even post-war Europe and Japan and impose it on the Middle East. And there's a deeper issue here, and it's one that relates to Iran directly, because we haven't talked much about Iran. We have panel discussions on Israeli television. It's not like American television where everyone's so nice and say, my distinguished colleague from across the aisle, they usually say, you idiot, you dumbbell, you fascist. I got a lot of those expletives hurled at me last summer at the end of the 12-day war with Iran, when I said, hey, something, the Iranians may think they won this war. And everyone jumped on me. Because the Iranians, I said, they just stood up to the biggest superpower in the world for 12 days. They fired performatively at Qatar, and the Americans immediately backed down. And not just backed down, they immediately tied the hands of Israel, their proxy. So the Iranians may have come to this war thinking they won, because in order to win the war, they had only not to lose. Well, the same thing holds true emphatically for Hamas. And it's been true in war after war after war in Gaza. We have to win. All they have to do is not lose. And as far as they're concerned, they have not lost. By the way, it's hard to gainsay that. They have not lost. They don't care about all the losses. They care that they come out of the tunnels. That's all they have to do. And if they have a gun in the other hand, it's even better. And so you're dealing with a quote-unquote victorious Hamas, which still has its guns.
So when you tell me on the one hand, Israelis are no longer willing to live with a jihadist death cult on their border, and on the other hand, the fact that the war is really not over in Gaza because Hamas still lives, are the Israelis just waiting for President Trump's plan to play out to demonstrate that Hamas is not going to disarm, there is no Palestinian leadership that's going to be able to take control, and ultimately give the green light for the IDF to go in and actually clear out the rest of Gaza?
But that raises some questions, not the least of which whether the IDF is capable of doing that, even if we got the green light. All right, that's one. Two, will the president be satisfied with maintaining the status quo until such a time as the status quo proves unworkable? Or will, conversely, there'll be the pressure on Israel to begin withdrawing from the 53% of Gaza that we control to enable some type of international stabilization force to replace us that will be unwilling, by the way, to combat Hamas? And will that cause further instability? Or, as I mentioned, you create these communities, these kind of sort of ideal communities. I don't want to call them Potemkin communities in the Israeli-controlled area of Gaza, and they very quickly become hotbeds of Hamas activity. The status quo may not be tenable for policymakers in Washington right now.
You're saying exactly what I'm worried about, which is Israel being at risk of being pulled into a long-term holding pattern where it neither fully occupies Gaza, but also cannot fully exit.
Or cannot fully retaliate.
Right, because if you have international troops there and they're serving as a buffer, they're essentially protecting Hamas.
Or you have international troops in Kiryat Gat who are observing our troops and restricting our movement, our maneuverability. As I mentioned before, there's a price to be paid for war, all right? Even a victory comes at a price. And I mentioned the price of blood and treasure and international relations, also a price to be paid in terms of our sovereignty. We are much more powerful than we were on October 6th, 2023, but in a certain way, we're far less sovereign.
Your hands are tired. Well, I will say this. I always come to you with the things I'm worried about, and I'm worried about more things now that I've spoken to you today.
I do not want to sound, how should I say, panic-stricken. I'm not. If you're in Israel, people ask me, what's the mood in Israel? They ask me all the time. And I said, people are out in the street, people in the cafes, people on the beaches. Life has returned to a large extent to normal. And yes, there are the issues in Gaza. Yes, there are the issues in Lebanon. The big one in Iran, we don't know. But we're not facing Iran alone anymore either.
That's true.
So let's look on the bright side of that. And the world now is it's understanding what Iran is. The Europeans just designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. For Iran, in many ways, the party's over for that regime. And we know. And in certain ways, they know. They're not coming back. And so there's many reasons to feel optimistic about the future, to certainly give vast amounts of credit to the hundreds of thousands of people who participated in this war, actively in a combat role or otherwise.
I am eternally grateful to the soldiers that fought and defended Israel and returned the hostages. We'll never be able to repay the debt that they have paid to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. And that leaves me at least tentatively optimistic. Until next time.
Until next time.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. This show is produced by Yochai Meital and Alma Ben-Zev. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we are so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you nod vigorously, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 easy ways to support the show. First, follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors like you. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.